Hello, and welcome to another one of our FairTalks episodes. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce you to our guest, Udo Jude Ilo, who's at the Center for Civilians in Conflict. With nearly 2 decades of experience in the democracy and social innovation space, Udo has led advocacy efforts across West Africa, including election work in 10 focus countries and the creation of the West Africa Elders Platform. He's testified before the US Congress and is a published author in the outlets like Foreign Affairs. As founder of the Natasha Ilo Foundation, Udo also explored themes of resilience and loss through poetry. So we're very excited to have you today for our Peace and Reconciliation series. Thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
To start off, can you briefly tell us, for all the listeners who might not know the Center for Civilians in Conflict, what is it exactly and what does the organization work in to protect civilians?
Okay, thank you. The Center for Civilians in Conflict, CIVIC, turned 20 last year. It's been around now for 2 decades and was founded by Mala Ruzika, who was a lone campaigner in Iraq 20 years ago, pushing the military in the United States to rethink the way they manage issues of civilian harm, regardless of the fact if they followed all the letters of the laws of war. She felt that if people are harmed in the course of military operations, the military needed to acknowledge that and take steps to mitigate such harm. And it was something novel, but essentially it caught up because she made the point that these are people with life, with stories, that have families. It was not just okay to treat them as numbers. And over the last 20 years, this audacious vision of Ruzika has become a global language where we now talk about protection of civilians in conflicts, in conflict situation. And for us in CIVIC, we've taken that vision and ideals of Ruzika and turned it into something that is much more programmatic, much more global, and much more community-based. So our work can be explained in 3 ways. One is in situations of conflict, we go in and work with local communities to understand their protection need, help them in articulating that and engaging with the right authorities, both military and civil authorities, to be able to ensure that the response to the conflict addresses the peculiar needs of those communities. Because we believe that people who are caught up in conflict, communities in conflict, have agency. They know best what is their protection need. And our work is to ensure that they're able to articulate those needs and are parts of the solution, are parts of the thinking process of solving those protection needs. The second layer of the work we do is helping military and security agencies to understand how to mitigate harm to civilians and how to protect civilians in such conflict situations. We do that by providing trainings to the military. We do that by helping them put together systems like civilian tracking systems that can help them understand when something has gone wrong and the steps they need to address those wrongs. We also provide military, civil military interface, helping the military and the communities to be able to have constructive conversation on how they can both work together, addressing each other's needs and concerns. The third layer of our work then is to take what we are learning from this engagement to then influence policy, both at the national level, at the regional level, at the global level, to help to strengthen the norms that speak to the protection of civilians, to help strengthen practices that speak to protection of civilians, to help share practices that allows countries across the world to have a better approach to the protection of civilians. So that is what we do as an organization.
Very interesting. Thank you so much for this overview. I'm curious if you could give a specific example of a current initiative in conflict zones what are some specific ones or projects that you could mention that CIVIC is currently working on where you're really promoting peace and protecting civilians? For example, I was really curious about what you said about the involvement of the community and that they have to be part of the solution. Could you give a specific example for that?
No, thank you very much.
Hey there, I'm so sorry for interrupting the flow. We just have a really quick message here from the Fair Planet team. So I hope I can have your attention just for a very little moment. First of all, thank you so much for tuning into our channel today. If you're here for the first time, in this series we sit down with activists, business leaders, academics and policymakers to discuss critical issues like sustainable development, environmental justice, human and civil rights and democracy. And as you may or may not know, Fair Planet is the force behind FairTalks and is a global producer of independent journalism. Through a network of more than 180 reporters in over 50 countries, we bring you stories that spotlight locally developed solutions to globally relevant crises and inspire real-world change. But the fuel to these stories is the support of our dedicated community. Your donation, no matter how small, helps us stay fiercely independent and continue the path of solution journalism. It ensures our on-the-ground reporting remains free and accessible to all. So if you can, we would greatly appreciate any kind of contribution. Even €1 can make a difference. And if you can't do that, you can still help us out by sharing our stories and spreading the word about our work. Please visit fairplanet.org/donate and join us on our journey. Thank you so much, and now enjoy the rest of this podcast.
So currently we work in Ukraine, we work in Yemen, we work in Somalia, we work in Nigeria, we work in Niger. And in all of these places I've mentioned, we've got what we call the Community Protection Group, which is the model of engagement that we've developed to address the issue of community-centered and community-focused approach to protection. And so, for instance, in Nigeria, in the northeast of Nigeria, we've got the Community Protection Group in a number of communities. One interesting thing that we've learned from that experience is that the communities are much more able to understand the dynamics and nuances of their challenge. And so in a place like the northeast of Nigeria, what the Community Protection Group did was to tell the military that their perimeter, which they put across the community to protect the community, has excluded their farms, meaning that they can't get food. And so with the military now, they were able to work out a system where the military escorted the women to the farm. So they're able to cultivate, bring food in, and they're able to feed themselves. Before that happened, food security was a challenge because they couldn't get food. But here the military was very convinced they were trying to help. But in essence, the most important thing to the community, which is access to their farm, was neglected. And with that kind of interface, that problem was solved. So this is something that happened in Nigeria. In Yemen, there were a lot of issues regarding abuse of civilians in checkpoints and the positioning of the checkpoints in a way that made it a little bit problematic for communities. And so this was creating friction between the military and the communities. The communities that were supposed to be working with the military were then feeling harassed by the military. And the intervention of the Community Protection Group led to the military then removing those checkpoints in areas where it was becoming detrimental to the communities. In Ukraine, besides the fact that we had community protection groups in a number of oblasts, we also pioneered a small grant that were given to community initiatives that allow them to address their peculiar needs. Things as basic as power banks that is needed because of the constant attack on military, on power installations. So we take this approach of looking at what is important to communities. What do they actually need to survive day to day? And how can we help them not just lead in addressing those challenges, but also vocalizing them to the relevant authorities? So in some places in Ukraine where we have our community protection group, we've gotten to a point where we have exited and the communities are now running those initiatives by themselves, meaning that, the question of sustainability has been addressed. But beyond what we do with communities, in Somalia, we are about the only NGO that is training the military and the militia on protection of civilians. And what we have done is that we've contextualized our training materials to speak to the daily realities of the Somalis. So we're not coming there with, all this technical language. We are helping them understand how they can protect civilians, but also to justify the need for them to protect those civilians, drawing from their own cultural practices and beliefs as a way of helping the illiterates also amongst the rank of the security operatives to be able to understand the importance of what they are doing. So this is what we are doing on a daily as at this moment. And we're also doing our international advocacy, going around, we are part of the coalition that is working towards the addressing the question of explosive weapons in populated areas. And the declaration that has been signed by more than 80 countries on explosive weapons in populated areas was part of the initiative that CIVIC, amongst other groups, were pushing for the last couple of years. And now we are working towards ensuring that countries who have signed up to these things are implementing it. In the United States, we are holding the government accountable to their own policies about not giving arms to countries who might use them in a way that breaches international humanitarian law and laws of war. And we are using those things to call out the Biden administration and encourage them to behave differently in Gaza. So, these are some of the things that we're doing. I mean, there's a whole lot of list of stuff we're doing. But the point I want to make is there are three distinct things that I find compelling in the work we do. One is building on the agencies of communities. Two is speaking up on a global standard and national standard that allows a better framework for the protection of civilians. And the third one is the collaborative approach to protection, trying to work with other groups, across to ensure that we speak the same language, we amplify each other, and we complement each other.
Thank you for that summary. I was going to ask, in your experience, what are key strategies for the prevention of civilian harm in conflict zones, which you just already elaborated a lot on. But what, on the other hand, then would you say are patterns that lead to the opposite, that lead to the failure of protection of civilians in conflict zones?
Yeah, thanks. If there is one thing that I've come to see in a number of instances, I wouldn't go into specific instances, but it appears that sometimes governments or military establishments see the protection of civilians as an additional burden. So they don't see it as something that helps them. They see it as something that gives them extra work. And in a number of places, when people are so much focused on military goals, these principles and practices are ignored because they look at it that, this is not helping. This is taking energy from what we should be doing, which is, clean off the enemy or winning the war, whatever. So in instances where the military objective or political objective is placed above the principles of civilian protection, it becomes really counterproductive and creates an environment that makes it difficult for these principles and practices to be respected. The second one, of course, is the question of ignorance. Colleagues who are working in the field come back and say, in a number of engagements with the military establishment or security sector, we realize they do not have a proper appreciation of some of these principles. In some areas, there are no overarching government policy or military strategy that embraces these principles. And so adherence or application of these principles are a bit ad hoc. And there is, of course, if there is no strategy, there is no enforcement system that allows the country to go back and say, this is how we have operated within this period, and then we can make adjustments. So absence of those kinds of policy and strategic framework undermines the respect for civilian protection. The third one, of course, is that a lot of times military engagement or military operations do not take into account the views of civilians and communities for which the military believe that they are protected. And so you want to protect somebody, but you're not in consultation with them to understand what their needs are and to find ways you can mitigate those concerns and challenges. And so without working with communities, there's failure of intelligence, obviously. There's misunderstanding between the community and the military or the security agencies, and there's distrust. And in those environments is everyone to himself. And these principles are not, of course, respected. The final point I would mention also is that there are a lot of external dynamics where you have multiple countries supporting multiple parties to a conflict. Then you have multiple parties in the conflict. So even the process of coordinating between all of these various parties to ensure, for instance, that humanitarian aid go in as it should, to ensure that civilian corridors are protected as it should, it becomes operationally impossible because you've got too many influences, too many parties, and too many interests in the conflict. So these are some of the few things that I have seen that really undermine a much more robust protection system for civilians in conflict situations.
I was thinking to move a bit into the democracy space, given that you have so much experience in that field. How do you see the intersection between the promotion of democracy and the pursuit of peace and reconciliation, particularly in regions affected by conflict?
So, if we go to Africa, for instance, and look at all the countries that are now enmeshed in conflict, almost all of them have had a history of very poor governance system. That poor governance system has also been a victim of fragile democracy or absence of democracy. So when the quality of governance is remarkably low, non-inclusive, not transparent, when it doesn't address the day-to-day need of the people, there is always a danger that it devolves into conflict. Because if the democratic system or the governance system cannot provide response to people's agitation, either agitation to be heard, agitation to be in government, or agitation to have food, when it doesn't respond to those things, then it escalates pretty quickly. And when it escalates, conflict doesn't know borders. I said in my recent blog that your border is only as safe as the next border. So if I have a porous border, or if there's a conflict in my country and people are running away from my country, it makes mockery of your own border. And so you carry that insecurity from one country into the next. So the point I'm then making is that there is a close relationship between the quality of governance and the promotion of peace and security. Without good governance, there is always a tendency that countries devolve into conflict. And when you have conflicts, and which is the vicious circle, when you have conflict, it is difficult to have good governance because the resources of government are then all applied to trying to solve the conflict. So there's a huge link between the two. which also brings me to a second point, that democracy as a concept is good. We all ascribe to it. But what matters is the implementation of those concepts and those principles. And whenever people who ascribe to those democratic ideals are not able to live up to the principles of those ideals, it creates space for people to begin to undermine the system as it is and endanger peace and security in those countries.
You're mentioning the impact of poor governance. How can good governance be promoted then, and how can these things be changed? More democracy promoted, and maybe that's a way also to get to your key roles in election processes.
So, if I understand you correctly, you're talking about how do we promote good governance?
Exactly. Yeah, let's start with that.
Good. I think I'll put three things on the table. One is the process that brings leaders into place. The second is the inclusive nature of that leadership. The third one is the adherence to rules. So when you start with the process that brings people into leadership, when electoral systems are manipulated, as is the case in a lot of countries, when the electoral systems are manipulated, it doesn't throw up the best kind of leaders into the system. Sometimes political systems are built in a way that it rewards bad behavior. That people who are really terrible people, or people who have no principles, who have no respect for rules, are able to manipulate the system and get into governance. And that alone delegitimizes the government we're talking about. Now, added to that also is the political environment within which these leaders are being elected. There's always that tendency that, the best way to get good governance is to have elections. I beg to differ. I think it is important to address fundamental and foundational issues that creates friction within a society, that creates distrust within a society. It is important to respond to those and address them even before you talk about election. Because elections cannot be isolated from what is affecting the society. So if it's a toxic society, the elections will be toxic. It will produce toxic leaders. So my point then is the process. And when I'm talking about process, not just the election alone, is also the kind of relationship, the kind of energy in that space, the level of cohesion in that space, the ways that we address polarization and all of those frictions that affect the quality of a society. All of these feed into the kind of people you throw up and the kind of system you have. The second element then is that when you have these people then coming, how inclusive is their government? An inclusive government is not just about involving people in decision making. It's also involving people in the distribution of resources, in the availability of opportunities. That's what I mean by inclusion. It is holistic. It's beyond just consulting people to do a budget, but making sure that everybody benefits from the resources of the state. And the third point I made is about the rule of law. Who is everybody is guided by those laws. Because you see in some of the dictatorships, if I may, that we see today, why they may not have the rule of law like we understand it in liberal democracies, they are still guided by some principles. There are some things they cannot do. There are limits to the powers they can exercise. And so having some form of guardrails in the way a country is run, whether as a democracy or not as a democracy, is important in ensuring that people believe that we have a stake here and this person cannot just do whatever they want. And in countries where you see the pattern where leaders can do whatever they want, like we see in Russia, you obviously see that the quality of life is a bit of a challenge because the system is held together by fear rather than by law. So, just to say, therefore, that it is important that when you have an effective and progressive system of selecting leaders, inclusive system of governing, and a rule-based order in the ways the government is managed, there are greater chances that such a country will have good governance.
I'm just wondering, because you were saying that it's within a community, also within a society, if there's like mistrust already happening, like from the bottom up, how can that be addressed? How can a society build more trust between each other, and that therefore create better governance?
Yeah, no, no, yeah, thanks for that question. Trust building requires some level of leadership. It requires conversations. People need to talk to each other, regardless of whether they like each other or not. So, if I use the work we do at the community protection level, bringing people together, people who may not ordinarily be talking to each other, but bringing them together within a particular space helps them to know each other. A lot of times, polarization and distrust is a function of ignorance because you don't know the other person. So take, for instance, in some communities in Ukraine, where when the Russians took over those communities, some people stayed back, some people ran away. And when those communities were liberated, you would, of course, expect that people who came back and those who stayed back, there's some level of mistrust amongst them. Oh, why did they stay back? What did they say? But we realized that when our colleagues were working with the communities on the community protection groups, which, of course, was set up to help address protection needs. But you then realize that it provided a space for these people to start talking to each other, to understand each other better. And it contributed in helping to build trust again amongst them. So I think communication, honest communication and conversation is a very good way of helping people to trust each other. Because when you talk to people, you know them. When you know them, you understand where they're coming from. And when you understand where they're coming from, you then realize that, there's really nothing different amongst all of us. We have the same challenges. We want our kids to grow in a safe environment. We want the good things of life. And having that realization helps people to then see there's a common interest. And people start working around those common interests. And by extension, it addresses the question of trust amongst those communities.
Very interesting. And in that sense, could you tell us a bit about the West Africa Elders Platform? What is it exactly? And could you share some insights on how this platform operates and what's the impact on regional dynamics?
No, thank you. So, when I look back in my work in Africa, the West Africa Elders Forum counts for me as one of the things I'm really, really proud of. Now, the whole idea when we started having conversation and, with the team within Open Society Foundation in designing this initiative with President Goodluck Jonathan, former president of Nigeria, was that you were looking at a region that in the early 20s was seen as a beacon of democracy because of the way the democratization fever caught up in the region. There were elections everywhere. The Economic Community of West Africa States, which is the regional body in West Africa, was also seen as a very unique regional body that was ensuring and pushing for democratic practices across its member states. And you fast forward to the last 5 to 6 years, and the deep decline in in the democratic fortunes of the region, and of course, the expanding footprints of authoritarian regimes within the region, we felt then that it might be helpful to look at the past leaders in the region, bring them together, one as a resource for all the other for the current leaders, because these guys, they've run a country, they understand what you're going through, as a resource. Then secondly, as an alternative voice for mediation, because there were a lot of political frictions within countries, and sometimes the Economic Community of West Africa states, because it is a member states organization, is somehow caught up in the conflict. You see what I mean? And we felt that having these external voices of those who were past leaders, who were once in ECOWAS, the Council of the Heads of States of ECOWAS, who were once there, who were once leaders themselves, that they are then able to offer some impartial perspective and provide a trusted platform to mediate some of the frictions within the region. And so that was the thinking behind it. And then the former president of Nigeria, President Jonathan, was very willing to drive that initiative. And I think about 7 or 8 of them came together in the first instance, and subsequently others joined. And what they have done over the years, I mean, I don't work for them, but, given that we had some role in the creation of the platform, I still have good interactions with the platform. But what they've done over the years is to provide back channel negotiations and mediations in what could have become very tricky and dangerous political situations in the region. They have access. They could pick up their phone and call these presidents. They could pick up their phone and call opposition leaders, and they go in and they have conversations. So they've been providing that back channel diplomacy now successfully. I mean, of course, there are places where the problems are still subsisting, but what they have done is that they've provided an alternative channel of engagement in a region that is often very much very much challenged by the political interests of current heads of state. So if something happens in another country, the reaction of heads of states might not be as objective as former heads of states offering opinion on what could be done differently to address the situation. So that's what they've been doing. I think, however, that this is a model that, especially in places where we have a lot of fragility, that could really be very helpful in engendering honest conversation, in allowing people to talk to each other, and then providing those good offices because of their retirement from politics, so to say. And we think they can also play a role in other issues like gender-based violence, being able to bring that kind of political clouds and visibility to these important issues. I believe that they can play beyond just the politics and the peace and security component of it. They can also be useful in these kinds of sensitive conversations around gender-based violence, and they could play a major role in those areas.
Have you seen a concept like this anywhere else applied, where elders are coming together and giving advice, or is that unique to West
we
Africa?
have the Global Elders Forum, which was set up by Mandela and some of these other leaders. So that was a bit of an inspiration. But I guess the difference here is that this is much, much local. These people are hands-on. They understand. They live in those environments. And so they are better able to provide a much more nuanced and pragmatic interventions real time in those communities. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very unique. I'd like to ask you a bit about your various roles leading advocacy delegations to Brussels, London, and the United Nations, and Washington, D.C. Can you highlight an instance where these advocacy efforts resulted in tangible outcomes for for civilians affected by conflict?
Well, yeah, thanks. I mean, those were before my time in CIVIC. Yeah, and some of them were during my time in CIVIC because,
Okay.
of course, in CIVIC uh, we've got quite a team. We've got our advocacy outposts in DC, in New York, in Brussels, and of course, at the regional level, we've got our team also doing advocacy work. And so the ones that happened before my time in CIVIC were most of the times built around governance and safety and security issues in Africa, Nigeria in particular. So I will just take one example from each. On the civic side, one of the things I inherited when I became the senior director for advocacy was the more than a decade advocacy that civic with other groups were championing in the United States to get the Department of Defense to have a much more holistic policy around civilian harm mitigation. And that advocacy had been going on before I joined, continued when I joined. And essentially, in 2020, ending of 2022 or thereabout, or early 2023, I'm mixing up the timeline now. The United States then adopted the CHIPRAP, the Civilian Harm Mitigation Policy, which was unprecedented, both in its remit in terms of how expansive it was, but also in some of the principles that they tried to pursue within that policy. And so for us in CIVIC, we saw that as a major advocacy win, which, like I said, speaks to the campaign Mala Ruzika started 20 years before about how do you mitigate harm and how do you recognize harm done to civilians. And now, 20 years down the line, for the country to then have this kind of holistic policy that addresses those questions, that also established the Center of Excellence, which is a center that then helps government to interrogate how it is implementing this policy, how effective it is, and provide support in making sure that this policy is effectively rolled out. So yeah, so for us, it's a major advocacy win. But the point to underscore is that it wasn't just civic alone. It also showed us the power of collaborative advocacy, where we work with other groups and lend our voice to these important things. And we are seeing countries like the Netherlands taking similar steps to develop their own policy, and CIVIC has been involved in that efforts at the invitation of the Dutch government. So yeah, you can't overstate the importance of advocacy and helping people change policy. Before my time in CIVIC, I think one of the very successful advocacy efforts that I championed was the way we internationalized the 2015 election in Nigeria. It was an election between an incumbent and a non-incumbent, of course. And a lot was riding on it. There was a lot of worry that it might degenerate into major violence because of the rhetoric, because of the events that happened prior to it. But we were then able to make it a global conversation. We were then, through our visit to the United States, to the UK, we got Obama to make a statement on the election, to send a message to the Nigerian people. We had the Secretary of State and the Secretary of State UK, Secretary of State the United States, Secretary of State UK, Minister for Foreign Affairs, or in the UK, come together to issue joint statements during the election, calling out some of the challenges they see with the election, but recognizing the risk that had been highlighted by the election observation groups in country. And it was a 3-layered kind of advocacy engagement. At the country level, we had what we call the election situation room, which brought together more than 50 civil society groups working around the election, having one platform to say what they see about the election. And it was real time. It wasn't just to wait after the election. They were saying these things as the election was being prepared, as the elections were happening, identifying problems and collectively calling those problems out, collectively providing solution. So making it impossible for the government to ignore them. So with that level of robust local intervention, it was then easy to create an international interest in what was going on. And the second layer of the engagement was then talking to the foreign governments to say, we need you to support us. And it was in that election, if I recall correctly, that the United States then proposed personal sanctions, individual sanctions against people who might undermine the election. And that was a result of the advocacy of civil society groups in Nigeria. It was in the same election that International Criminal Court said that we are observing events in this election, and people who, by the action, might create mass atrocities, we will step in and do what we're supposed to do. So being able to build up that kind of global attention, in my view, was quite remarkable. And it saved the day, in my view, because a lot of people behave differently when they realized that they were not just contending with the local jurisdiction or the local rule. They were now contending with a global interest that could impose heavy sanctions on them, assuming, that they behave badly. And all of this was because of the work civil society did in the country in internationalizing that election and making it something significant enough for the world to pay attention.
Yeah, fascinating. It's very impressive what local action and collaboration and time can move, really. That's very fascinating. As a final question, I'd like to ask you, in your opinion, how can the international community better collaborate to address the complex challenges of civilians caught in conflict? And adding on to what you just said, what role can advocacy and policy play in facilitating such collaboration?
I've spoken a lot in recent times about the need for consistency. It has to be same rule for everybody, same rule. So the framework of international humanitarian law cannot be subordinated to politics. So if my friend does it, it's okay. If my enemy does it, now we can't allow it. So we need to have the international community, countries, to respect the rules of international humanitarian law. And the rules are very clear about the protection of civilians. And if we do that, if you have that kind of shared understanding and shared respect for this process, it will help to protect civilians. The second thing, of course, is we need countries to have policies that address these challenges, policies on civilian protection. We need countries to sign up to convention, to global framework like the EWIPA, Explosive Weapons in Populated Area, the declaration. We need countries to sign up to those things so that when countries domesticate these principles in their own space, it becomes easy to implement because their military knows that this is the rule, this is the law. The security agencies know that this is the rule, this is the law. Civil society knows this is the rule, this is the law. And they can then advocate based on those principles that have already become part of the local legislation. The third thing, of course, is educating the public to understand. So take, for instance, when Gaza happened and the way communities, individuals went into the streets and made demands from their government, we saw leaders change their position because of demands of their own citizens. We need to see more people understand those principles so that just the way we talk about climate change, we can start talking about civilian protection. And the moment civilian protection creates political consequences for leaders, you and I know that behavior will change.
Yeah.
because they don't want to lose election based on that. So having more people, communities, people as in the world citizens understand the importance of civilian protection is one sure way of making the demand for its respect sustainable and powerful.
Yeah, wow, very interesting. Thank you so much for your insights. I think that's it from my end. Do you have anything that I didn't touch on that you'd like to share? Any question that I maybe left out? Something?
No, nothing. I mean,
Okay.
nothing to share. Just to underscore the point that we also need to acknowledge that civilian protection, the conversation has evolved. As much as there are a lot of challenges, it is important to also acknowledge there has been gains over the years.
Yeah.
The way now, for instance, the United Nations Secretary General issues a report every year on civilian protection. You see what, it's something huge.
Yeah.
It elevates the conversation to a different level. We have more organizations working around the space. More people are interested in the conversation. More tools are coming out that can help the military security agencies do better. So yes, we recognize there are a lot of challenges, but also folks who have been working in this space for decades now have something to be proud of, because we
Absolutely.
are actually increasingly moving to a place where it is no more a side conversation. It is now the conversation. And I think that is progress.
That's definitely very crucial. I mean, we've seen it now also with what is happening in Gaza. The international community is so loud and outraged. But I'm always wondering also that, you were mentioning the principles and rules and laws that have to be put in place and policies. But what to do if countries don't adhere to it? Like, people, yes, have to be louder, but I'm always wondering if there's more that can be done to kind of shake the governments a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, it's gradual. It's a gradual
Yeah,
process. These things, they don't happen. They don't happen once. It's a gradual process. We'll get there.
yeah.
That's what I think, because I think the trajectory is on the upsurge. More people are speaking up. More people are outraged about these things, and the more voices we get around them, the chances that leaders will start feeling the pinch when they don't behave properly.
That's very true. Yeah, thank you so much for all your insights. It was really interesting to hear your perspectives.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.